that you answer those questions that we downloaded. All right. So real quick, I'm going to go through the early Enlightenment period. So understand, by the 1400s, there's an intellectual revolution happening, and it begins with the Protestant Reformation and the Renaissance. And those two events are important because they're going to give way to the scientific revolution and enlightenment. So you want to be able to make that connection. So remember, the Protestant Reformation was this, trend where Martin Luther and other members of the church were questioning the authority of the priests and the Pope. The Renaissance, out of the Renaissance emerged humanism that encouraged the idea of, independent thought and studying the humanities, studying philosophy and studying political science and religion. And that's going to lead to intellectuals questioning science, right? And applying, natural laws and using reason and logic, like the scientific method to better understand the environment around us, right? Up to that point, the church had their own views on science, and scientists like Galileo started to challenge those beliefs. And then that's going to kind of lead to the Enlightenment, where political scientists are going to, again, apply, the same logic and reasoning to politics and society. And they're going to start to, push for the idea that there's this natural set of laws that or natural rights that we're born with, right? And again, they're going to encourage people to use reason and logic to question entities like the monarchy. All right, so the Enlightenment, again, it was using scientific reasoning to analyze and study politics and society. And again, they're using these idea of, not natural scientific laws or laws of science, but laws of society, right? And this idea that we're born with certain natural rights. And again, they're just trying to better understand government and how to best improve society. So it's really also an age of progress. They're seeking to improve not only how governments govern, but also how we live in a society. During the Enlightenment, religion was not as important. It's not that these philosophers were atheists. They just didn't believe as strictly. They weren't strict observers of religion. So, for example, many question bans on divorce. So they question the idea of not working on Sundays, for example. So we're going to see a growing secularism, right, where church and state are going to be more separated. Deism is actually also interesting, and it's an important term to remember. It is a belief system that was applied to, or at least implemented or utilized by many of these philosophers like Ben Franklin. And it's the idea that God did exist, but he set certain natural laws in motion, but didn't interfere or cause miracles. So it's like they use the analogy of a watchmaker. The watchmaker makes a watch, but he doesn't interfere in its day-to-day workings. He just makes it, you turn it on, and it goes, right? So it's really more of an impersonal relationship with God and the rejection of miracles and certain deep faiths. And again, church was more of a moral guide, not necessarily dictating whether or not we're getting into heaven or not. They're going to reject the idea of predestination, no doubt. So deism is a good term to remember. It's very, again, it's really represents the changes in attitudes towards religion. All right, so two philosophers we definitely want to remember are Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. They both believed in the idea of a social contract, but they had two different ideas about it. So Thomas Hobbes was kind of believed that society was brutish and people were inherently evil, and therefore you needed a strong ruler to govern, right? To make sure that there was order. And so basically the people and the ruler engaged in a contract. And this contract stipulated that in exchange for freedom, in exchange for giving that ruler a lot of autonomy, you would get in return law and order, prosperity. John Locke saw it differently, though, that the contract was more about the ruler would protect your rights and he would guarantee your natural rights. And if if he limited those rights or denied those rights, he breaks that contract, and the people are justified to revolt. His views were very important to our Declaration of Independence. John Locke kind of, articulated the idea of natural rights, or which would be life, liberty, and property, and the government has to protect those rights. He also believed that education was very important and that the environment did shape people. So I definitely remember these two men, but in connection to the social contract theory. This is one of the famous cartoons you'd see that kind of summarizes Thomas Hobbes. You might notice the people, inside or on the ruler, right? They are, he oversees them, right? He protects them. He takes care of them. All right, so you should know a couple more philosophers. Mary Wollstonecraft was an Enlightenment philosopher who promoted women's rights, especially equal education. Montesquieu was a French philosopher who promoted the idea of separation of powers. I think that's an easy one to remember, right? We base our constitutional government is based on his ideas of a checks and balance system, right, where Congress checks the president has certain checks on Congress, and vice versa. And obviously there's the third branch of government, the judicial branch. Voltaire, another French philosopher, was a proponent of civil liberties. He was close to Catherine the Great, and it's believed that his promotion of freedom of religion helped influence our Bill of Rights, right? One of our amendments. Rousseau, another French philosopher, he probably had more influence on the French Revolution. He was very critical of the privileges that the First and Second Estate had, the aristocracy. He too believed in a social contract, and the aristocracy or ruling class broke that contract, and therefore the people were justified in revolting. He also was a proponent of education reform, the idea of nurture over nature, that the environment, he actually believed more in nurture, that that you could, with good, with a good education system, you could overcome your environment. His biggest piece was the general will. He believed that it was the obligation of the government to carry out the general will of the people. If the majority of people want a certain policy, it was the obligation of the ruler or the government to make sure that policy was implemented, even if the minority didn't want it, right? So that's a great little piece to remember for Rousseau. Again, you don't have to remember all of these men and women, but try to remember 2 or 3. Adam Smith, very important, an economic philosopher. Definitely remember him. He wrote a book, The Wealth of Nations. He was very critical of mercantilism. Remember, mercantilism is this idea that, the colonies serve a purpose for the parent country. And it's up to the colonies to provide raw goods and a market. But mercantilism also, under mercantilism, the parent country implements tariffs and embargoes, where forcing the colony to only trade with the mother country. So, for example, the American colonies at times were restricted from trading with France or Spain. So limiting trade restrictions is not what Adam Smith believes is productive. He believed in free trade, or laissez-faire economics. It's a French term for hands-off. He believed that tariffs were terrible. Mercantilism restricts free trade, and that the government should minimize regulations like tariffs and interventionism, taxes, embargoes, and just basically let the market regulate the economy through supply and demand. So definitely remember Adam Smith's, he was an opponent of mercantilism and a proponent of laissez-faire economics. All right, so some of the rulers of the time were known as enlightened despots, kind of on one hand they were progressive and they studied the philosophers, but on the other hand, kind of like an oxymoron, right? How could you be an enlightened despot? But they were. Napoleon, for example, was a great example of that, where these despots were, maybe they studied the philosophers, they were very educated, they wanted to achieve progress, like Catherine the Great right here. They were tolerant of other religions. However, when it came to kind of freedom of opinion, for example, they were not in favor of that. They were not democratic in any way. They did not believe in really a republican government where the people had an indirect say in the government. They often ruled without advice, without the consent of a legislative body, and Napoleon's a great example of that. Napoleon was an emperor, right? And he ruled authoritatively, but he did a lot of positive things and a lot of progressive reforms. You have Maria Theresa of Austria. If you see her, that's probably where College Board's going. That she was an enlightened despot, right? Encouraging progress, but on the other hand, centralizing her power. All right, so we're getting into the revolutions. So the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the Creole Revolutions, they had a lot of similarities, and you want to be able to explain those similarities. And most of them had similar steps where it starts out where the citizens are very unhappy with government. It might be the lowest class, maybe like in Haiti, the slaves. It might be the middle class, like in the American, French, and Creole revolutions, where the middle class was unhappy. They might have wealth, and they might even have land, but overall they want more autonomy or they want more political power. We call them moderates as well. As time goes on, they gain more power. Then in many cases, there's a radical phase. That was not the case in the American Revolution, but it was the case in the French Revolution. And that's going to be a violent piece to a revolution or a violent phase. And then that follows a period of calm, a Thermidorian reaction, we call it. Again, that's probably more common in the Creole revolutions and in the French Revolution. All right, so the American Revolution, it was, again, a middle-class revolution. We didn't really have this is not a slave rebellion. There was no feudal system in the Americas. So really the leaders of the American Revolution were merchants and landowners, plantation owners. They were lawyers like Sam Adams or John Adams, merchants like Sam Adams, landowners like like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. And overall, they just kind of were tired of British mercantilism. They were tired of the embargoes and the tariffs, and they wanted to trade freely. They also wanted to govern on their own. They didn't want independence right away. Even Ben Franklin didn't want to see, them break away from England. But what they truly wanted was to be free of British influence, at least. The king was limiting the power of colonial legislators. The colonies wanted to pretty much represent themselves at home. They didn't want to have any kind of representation in England. They wanted to do what they wanted to do. But at the same time, they wanted the protection of the king, and that's where the king really, wasn't agreeing with that. Also, as time would go on, the colonies were unifying. They were developing their own sense of nationalism, their own sense of, self, autonomy, for example. But over time, what it really comes down to is the king refused to compromise, and he refused to let them govern their own trade or govern themselves, and that was it. And we know what happened. The French Revolution was a little different. Definitely a middle-class revolution as well, but the lowest class, the peasant class, was very unhappy as well. So the Third Estate, again, comprised of the peasants, comprised of the moderate middle class, and together they revolted against the ruling class and the religious class, the First and Second Estate. Mostly over taxes. The Third Estate was taxed heavily. They had very little say in political decisions, so they were fed up. And on July 14th, 1789, the famous storming of the Bastille was a former prison that contained weapons, so the idea would be to take those weapons and revolt. Once in power, they abolished feudalism. That was to appease the peasants. And they established the Declaration of Rights of Man, kind of a combination of our Bill of Rights and Declaration of Independence. They put the church under state control. That was very important. The Catholic Church was pretty much wiped out. And then there was the terror phase where the bourgeoisie or that middle class kind of seized control of this revolution and went after any opponents, even peasants, even their own moderate neighbors. There's a famous story where a young boy cuts down a liberty tree, or a tree that represents liberty, that was planted in support of liberty, and he was executed because of that, even though it was probably a mistake. So really, this Maximilien Robespierre was the leader of this reign of terror. He was a Jacobin. It was the political group, and he pretty much went after anyone who went against him, a dissenter. Even Olympe de Gouges, a famous female supporter of rights. She wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Women and the female citizen. She was taken out because she was critical of men. So again, Robespierre really had no problem eliminating you if you didn't support his oppressive ways. He even banned religion. He was trying to make himself into almost a godlike figure. That was followed with a Thermidorian reaction by 1794. Eventually, moderates kind of recognized that Robespierre had lost his mind, and he was quickly executed. Unlike the American Revolution, though, the French people didn't sustain democracy for at least not for a while, and that was pretty much replaced by an oligarchical government where a directory of a few moderates kind of governed. They weren't elected by the majority of the people. They did some progressive things like preserving natural rights and abolishing slavery, but eventually they were replaced by Napoleon, who became an emperor, and obviously he eliminated any forms of democracy. Now, again, he was an enlightened despot because of his reforms. He made sure everyone was paying equal taxes, which was progressive for the country. The Code of Napoleon, you could add that to your law codes, right? Like the Hammurabi's Code or the Edicts of Ashoka. He established the idea of equality, a lot of tolerance for religion, trial by juries, very important. So he did a lot of great things for France. He established a lot of precedents that would eventually become the fabric of French democracy. People loved him. He established a public school system. Government was based on meritocracy. There's a great connection to Chinese history. The problem was he terrified European neighbors. He was very aggressive. He invaded Portugal, Russia. He had pretty much taken over all of Europe, including Germany. And so because of that, an allied force of Austria, Russia, Prussia, and England kind of went after him and defeated him in battle, famous Battle of Waterloo. You wouldn't have to remember that. But what's important is what happens after. After Napoleon is taken out by these European forces, the Congress of Vienna is kind of established. These countries come together and form this kind of political body to figure out what to do with France. And pretty much they put back into power a monarch. One of the Louis goes back into power. And that's it. Democracy ends. For the time being, eventually democracy emerges again. But that's an important change politically in Europe. That in 1850, these revolutionary forces kind of come to an end, and it's the resurgence of conservatism, right? Traditional governments, aka monarchies and absolute governments. So these revolutions and these popular upheavals kind of die out a little bit. So that's important to remember. The French Revolution wasn't sustained. The American Revolution was successful in the Americas, but it didn't translate to other revolutions in Europe, like in Austria, right? Austria was ruled by a king. The people of Austria didn't overthrow that queen or that king. So that's going to continue. All right, Haitian Revolution, very important. Right in and around the French Revolution, during Napoleon's time in office, Maroons. Maroons were escaped slaves who kind of eventually revolt against their slave masters. Important term to remember. They were led by Toussaint Louverture, another a French, or actually a Haitian citizen. He was inspired by the Enlightenment, inspired by the American and French revolutions, and he gathered an army of not only the Maroons but also enslaved Africans. So what the Haitian Revolution was, it's probably the most successful slave rebellion in the history of the world. Not only did it establish a new government, but eventually, it's the first, African, we'll call it American independent country. America in the sense that it's in the Americas. He established a constitution that guaranteed equality, citizenship for all Haitians, but he made himself governor for life. So again, we're not seeing complete democracies here. I think that's important to remember. Really, the United States was the only true democracy in the world at the time. Land reforms were very effective. He took land from those French slave owners, redistributed to former slaves and those Maroons. So a really important piece in history, I would definitely remember it. Again, it's really a slave uprising. There's a radical phase, but I would probably argue this was less a middle-class rebellion than it was a lower-class rebellion. Again, the people of Haiti did achieve independence in 1804, and it's considered the first post-colonial independent black-led country. even though Toussaint didn't lead it during the early stages, or at least for a while. He was eventually arrested. So important revolution to remember. All right, the Creole Revolution is very different than the Haitian Revolution. Not a lower class revolution, not a slave rebellion, but a rebellion like the American Revolution and French Revolution of the middle class. The Creoles, as we remember, were well educated, wealthy landowners, mine owners, business owners who their only problem is they were born in the Americas, right? And they were being governed by the Peninsulares, who were Spanish born in Spain. The Creoles might have been sons and daughters of those Peninsulares, perhaps. They were aware of not only the Enlightenment, but the French and American revolutions. They were also concerned about the mestizos, right? The mixed groups. They were concerned that those mestizos, who were highly, it was a highly populated group, would take over. And the Creoles would lose that opportunity. So at the end of the day, what they wanted was independence from Spain, especially when it came to trade policies like mercantilism. There's a great similarity to the American Revolution. And again, they resented the dominance of the Peninsulares, and they feared the growing power of the mestizos. The Mexican Revolution was led by Miguel Hidalgo, not a Creole, or at least he didn't really have the support of the Creoles. In theory, he's probably a Creole, but he was more of he led the mestizos to fight for independence. So different than Simon Bolivar, who you're going to learn about in a little bit. So he initiates this revolution in 1810, not successful in a sense that his group was defeated and executed when the Creoles turned on him. And that's going to lead to kind of conflict between Creole leaders. Santa Anna will go to battle with a Creole colonel named Iturberde, and eventually Santa Anna establishes a republic. He goes to war with the Texans, actually. He fights the Texans in the 1840s over the rights of the Texans. That's why I remember Santa Anna. Anyway, he establishes a republic, but he's a very authoritarian ruler. So really, we're not going to see true democracy emerge in Mexico for quite a while as well. You're going to see lots of battles between those Creole group leaders, right, going forward. And the Mexican government's going to go to war with us in 1846, the Mexican-American War. And also there's going to be a French invasion around that time as well. So again, a lot of instability during the 19th century in Mexico. But there is a revolution that is successful, and that Spain does give up its influence in this region in the early 1800s. All right, Simon Bolivar, definitely remember him. He's the leader of the Creole revolutions in South America. Inspired by the Reign of Terror, inspired by the Haitian Revolution, inspired by the American Revolution. He was a believer in the Enlightenment philosophers. He was a Creole from Venezuela, very wealthy Creole who used that wealth to initiate this independence movement. I would remember the Jamaica letter. Could be great additional information and essay about revolutions. It's his declaration of independence in a sense, where he establishes his platform or his beliefs. He was a liberal. He wanted less government influence. He was not a conservative because he didn't want to see a return to absolute monarchies, right? He wants to expel the Spanish. He was a critic of the mercantilist system, but he was also against slavery. So there's a progressive reform. Again, that was common of liberalism at the time. Eventually, he unites Venezuela, Ecuador, and Colombia under a federation known as the Grand Colombia, and oversees that federation. He was not a democratic proponent per se, but again, he's going to overthrow the Spanish and create independence in this region. What happens? Argentina declares independence eventually, Peru and Brazil. Even though Brazil maintained a monarch until about 1899, again, Spain is pretty much out by 1899. There was a lot of internal conflict between the Creole leaders like Bolivar and the caudillos. These were local military leaders who kind of emerged, and they would defend the peasants and local peoples, but they really disregarded the central governments that emerged in this region. And they really were not supporters of representative government or the rule of law. So we're going back to more of that Thomas Hobbes philosophy of a strong ruler who protects the people, but the people lose some of those natural rights or those natural freedoms. Slavery is pretty much abolished in this entire region. That's important. A lot of social systems, though, that favored the wealthy were reformed as well to create more economic equality, and that's important. However, some conservative governments did emerge. For example, in Peru, if you weren't educated, you couldn't vote. Now, I can tell you this, in the United States for a while, if you didn't own land, you couldn't vote, at least in the late 1700s, early 1800s. So that wasn't abnormal during the time to limit the male vote. Women could not vote at all or enter government, and that's going to be a continuation where women lack a lot of rights during this time. All right, so it's the age of isms. Remember some of these isms. It's during this time we see the ideology of socialism begin to emerge. It's going to be more common during the Industrial Revolution, which is the next chapter. But understand that it's definitely a philosophy that goes against laissez-faire economics. In this case, the government owns a lot of the businesses, especially a lot of the businesses that produce things. It's not just that the government controls, but the workers own. That's important. That not only does the government regulate, but the workers rise up and take over these industries, and they share in the wealth of those industries. So definitely understand how socialism operates. Utopian socialists, socialists would say to the workers, kind of rise up over time and take over. Don't run away, where a utopian socialist would say, just leave and create your own socialist community. And some of these socialists were Claude Henry de Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, and Robert Owen. Robert Owen is the famous American utopian believer. And again, utopian it means perfect society. He created right over here, literally a little community where the people shared in the work, in the labor. They banned child labor, so they lived communally, where they worked together, and no one was rich, no one was poor, everyone was prosperous in a sense, and that's kind of how socialism is supposed to operate. The Fabian Society in England emerges. They're gradual socialists. They didn't believe in just separating, for example, or they didn't believe in a violent takeover. They believed that over time government could, reform society through legislation, right? We're going to talk about democratic socialism later this week. I think that's the idea, where the government doesn't just control industry. They create laws that maybe protect the workers from capitalism, right? Maybe regulating capitalism, not destroying capitalism. Classic liberalism. So remember these terms, liberalism and conservatism. Remember, conservatism then means you support traditional governments like monarchies, right? Liberalism was a little different. It was very, yes, it believed that we have these natural rights, and the government should keep its hands off those rights or protect those rights. But they also believed in limited government when it comes to the economy. That's Adam Smith, who was a classic liberal. Not a lot of military spending, secularism, separation between the church and the state. But they did believe in giving, especially men, more voting rights. That's important. So it's a combination of increased freedoms, increased rights, less government intervention. That's liberalism. Today, liberalism, a liberal believes more in the idea of there should be government intervention when it comes to big business and the economy and the environment and education, right? It's interesting how these terms have changed a lot. We're going to skip Romanticism. I'm going to go to Zionism. So that's another important ism. Jews are looking to establish their own homeland. Remember, they've been spread out through diasporas. They've been attacked in pogroms, especially in Russia. They've been separated in Russia. That's a great example of anti-Semitism. And a great example of growing anti-Semitism had to do with the Dreyfus Affair. Dreyfus was a soldier who was Jewish, and a French military officer who was actually accused of treason, and he was convicted of that, but it's believed that he was not guilty of it, and it was based on anti-Semitism. So that's an interesting little fact to remember if you're writing about growing anti-Semitism during the time. And obviously by the early 1900s or 1930s, we know that's going to be quite prevalent in Europe, right, with the rise of Nazism. A lot of challenges to a Jewish homeland. They wanted to be in the Middle East, but the problem is the Ottoman Empire was a Muslim empire, and that region of Palestine was under Arab control. It was an Islamic world. Eventually, though, Israel was founded in 1948, so they did finally achieve that Jewish homeland after World War II. All right, and nationalism. So we're going to do nationalism real quick. So nationalism, again, is this love of country, the people coming together for the good of the country. And that's kind of the key term. It's unify, right? A unified nation. And that's going to happen a lot in Italy, or that's going to happen in Italy in 1870. Where remember, Italy was, or not remember, but Italy was a hodgepodge of little kingdoms and little states. It wasn't a unified nation. Each little kingdom had a king. The papal states, they were governed by the Catholic Church. So it was just, I guess, not very unified. Giuseppe Mazzini and Giuseppe Garibaldi are two Italians who wanted to unite the kingdoms. And they led early insurrections against Italian monarchies in Sicily. And they wanted more of a republic. Yes, maybe there's going to be a king, but there's going to be a constitution and a parliament that checks that king. So Camillo Benso emerges, the Count of Cavour. I would remember him. He finally helps unite Italy under one ruler. He wants that constitutional monarchy. He borrows from Mazzini. He recruits Garibaldi to help him, and eventually, under King Emmanuel, Italy is united, and Italy becomes Italy in 1870. He's a classic liberal, where he's a proponent of natural rights, but he does believe, it's not that he loved having a monarch, but he recognized that to appease conservatives, right, to compromise, he had to have an authoritarian ruler. But again, there's that constitution that checks him. He was known as a realpolitik. That's a good term to remember. He was a practical political scientist, or he believed that in reality, the reality is, you know what? He's not going to be able to have a truly democratic nation, so he had to compromise and work with the conservative forces. Realpolitik. I'm hearing that term a lot on the news, right? You've got radicals, and then you have realpolitik proponents that say, let's be realistic about things. German unification. So Germany, like Italy, was a hodgepodge of individual states. So Germany wasn't a country, Germany was a region. And in that region you had Prussia right here, a large, which is kind of today Germany, by the way, parts of Russia, Austria, Denmark, and some of these smaller states like Hanover, for example, and Bavaria, Bohemia. And Napoleon actually occupied this region in 1815. By 1848, we're going to see revolutions where the people in these regions are going to want, again, more of a constitutional government. So Otto von Bismarck emerges. He's not the king, but I feel he's the chancellor of Prussia. And he recognizes that what's best for this region is to unify. And so what he actually does is he manipulates a lot of these smaller regions to come together. He gets Austria to go to war against Denmark and Prussia. Prussia crushes Austria, so he kind of has Austria under control. Then he manipulates France. He gets France to declare war with Prussia. Prussia wins that war, so now Prussia has a lot of influence over this region. And in 1871, the German Empire is founded, and today this region is Germany. Austria is separate today, but most of this region right here, which was again a hodgepodge of city-states and kingdoms, is now today Germany. And Otto von Bismarck, I would remember him also because of his reforms. He was very afraid of growing socialist movements. He was terrified that the workers would rise up and overthrow the constitutional governments. So he actually, to appease them, to kind of catch the revolution, or slow the revolution down, he actually creates social insurance laws to help workers, like pensions. retirement funds. He establishes workman compensation laws. So again, he does that to, not that he loved workers, he wanted to make them happy so they wouldn't go to extreme levels. And again, that's kind of what happened in France, right? He really wanted to avert the radical revolution. All right, that's it, guys. Answer those questions and finish up.